2023 is over and now it's time to rank all the new TV shows I saw from worst to best. Now, these all just happen to be Disney Plus series. I did start watching the Monarch Legacy of Monsters show on Apple, but that show is not over yet. That show ends this year, 2024, so it will be included in next year's list. Which is also why a couple of these shows are shows that started in 2022, but didn't end until 2023. So with that in mind, let's get started. In last place at number 12 is National Treasure: Edge of History, one of the biggest disappointments of a TV show last year. This is not a National Treasure show in any way. You don't have Nick Cage, you've only got Riley in a very small role, and none of the characters have any charisma or even remotely likable. They're all super annoying, and instead of being a show about how great America is, it instead does the opposite of that, and spends the whole series ranting about how awful and evil America is, which is the complete antithesis to the franchise. There's a series of chapter books about the ancestors of Nick Cage's character, and those were fantastic. Why didn't they just adapt from those? This seems to me like it was a show that they wrote, but did very poorly with test audiences, so they put the National Treasure name on it for the sake of brand recognition to trick people into watching it, and it was nothing like National Treasure at all. Number 11, Willow. Another misfire of a TV show, straying incredibly far from the source material and only using the IP recognition to trick people into watching it. I hate this show just as much as I hated the National Treasure show, and the only reason it's higher on the list is because it at least had Warwick Davis in it, so it at least tried to be somewhat like Willow, but it massively failed. The rock soundtrack was so out of place, the characters use modern slang, the outfits don't fit in a fantasy setting at all, they got rid of Ed Mardigan, and instead we follow a cast of new characters, none of whom are interesting, and it has no right to call itself Willow. Number 10, Goosebumps. 3 shows in a row now, where they use the IP recognition to get views, and they completely miss the point and tone of the source material. This is not a kid-friendly show at all. It's way too dark and violent. It feels more like Stranger Things or Riverdale. It's not fun or campy. It's cringily modernized to try to appeal to Gen Z. And now you're probably thinking, well, the books and original show came out 30 years ago. Of course, they're updating it. And I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that. I mean, the Jack Black Goosebumps movie that came out a few years ago was a great example of how to do that right. And bizarrely enough, the same people who were involved with that movie are also involved with the show, but they completely botched it. The show focuses more on teen drama, and I was pretty shocked at some of the content of the show. There's profanity, including an uncensored F-word in the first episode. There's blood, there's graphic violence, there's sexual content. I could not believe some of the stuff I was hearing. There's references to infidelity, sex tapes. There's an episode involving a Halloween party, and one of the characters is a teenager dressed as a sexy cat. I don't know why the writers felt the need to sexualize teenagers. That's creepy. All the lessons from the source material are gone. For example, the Haunted Mask episode. The original episode from the show is about accepting yourself for who you are and not pretending to be someone you're not, loving yourself. This Haunted Mask episode feels more like a Michael Myers movie. It's incredibly dark, there's no lessons, the characters don't learn anything. Shame on you, R.L. Stine, for greenlighting this. Don't let your kids watch it, and if you're truly a Goosebumps fan, I don't recommend that you watch it either. This time, the viewer really should beware. Number 9, Secret Invasion. The most frustrating entry on this list, because it started out so good. It had a lot of intrigue, it had a more serious tone than a lot of the MCU, there was very little humor, it felt very X-Files, and I was really into it. But then the finale happened, and they completely dropped the ball. Number 9 is Secret Invasion. The most frustrating entry on this list, because it started out so good. It had a lot of intrigue, it had a more serious tone than a lot of the MCU, there was very little humor, it felt very X-Files, and I was really into it. But then the finale happened, and they completely dropped the ball. It suddenly became about all making Amelia Clark's character super OP. It had a ridiculous final battle, and the finale overall just made no sense. It was a complete departure from what the rest of the show had established. Number 8, Mandalorian Season 3. A very mixed bag of a season. For one, it requires having watched Book of Boba Fett. The other thing is a lot of this season did not really focus on Din and Grogu. I mean, at the end of Season 2, Din gives Grogu to Luke, and that should have been the end of the story. But Disney is so greedy for money that they have him reunite with Grogu in the middle of Book of Boba Fett, and so completely negates Din's whole character arc. The season didn't even really focus that much on them. It felt more like they made Bo-Katan the main character, and it essentially became her show. There's even an entire episode that just focuses on the Empire, and that episode feels like a test pilot for yet another possible Star Wars spin-off show. This season was just very mixed. Some of it was good, but it did not knock it out of the park like the first 2 seasons, and this season was overall pretty weak. Number 7, Loki Season 2. I really liked this season. The first 2 episodes were a bit too much of playing catch-up, but this is what I was hoping Season 1 was going to be like, the God of Mischief going through time. Season 1, I felt he was too trapped in the TVA. This season gave an excuse to do some even more bonkers stuff, but the finale was very derivative of the ending of the first Doctor Strange movie with all the time loop stuff, but how it ends in the end gave great closure to Loki's character arc. Not a perfect season, but still very satisfying. Number 6, The Santa Clauses Season 2. I thought the idea of the villain being an evil Santa who ruled during the Dark Ages was fun and clever. I enjoyed seeing more of the Council of Legendary Figures, and some of the problems I had with Season 1 were gone. Overall, a much better season. Number 5, What If Season 2. There was really only one bad episode in this season, and that was the finale. And that's just because the finale was very repetitive and felt like watching someone play a video game boss battle with different bosses. I like the stories they came up with this season. Season 1 felt very safe, but this season they were allowed to play in the sandbox a bit more. But I'm not a fan of how all the stories interconnect at the end. The novelty of this being a what-if show is that all the stories can and should stand alone. You're presenting a hypothetical idea. You're essentially doing fan fiction. None of it matters, nor should it. It's just fun. But they decided to continue some of the stories from Season 1 while acknowledging that they don't need to. The Watcher says in the episode of Captain Carter, I don't normally do sequels. However, and then you have the problem. When you keep reusing the same characters, when you keep continuing these stories that are supposed to stand alone, you lose a bit of the novelty and appeal. The ones that felt like they stood on their own, like the Die Hard parody, the Star-Lord and Hope team-up, the Mad Max homage episode, the story about Kahori because she's an original character, those were some of the best stuff they did, because those felt very one and done. Not everything needs a sequel. They feel very trapped inside a box by thinking they need to make this grand overarching story instead of just making an anthology. Number 4, Star Wars Vision Season 2. Speaking of anthologies, this is what I'm talking about. Every episode of the show feels very one and done. It's giving filmmakers permission to tell whatever Star Wars story they want in whatever style they want, and it's some of the best stuff they've ever put out. All the different animation styles are fantastic, the stories are all well told and emotional, and I really hope we get Season 3. Number 3, Ahsoka. For me, the diehard fan who tries to consume as much Star Wars content as possible, I thought it was an absolute treat. For the casual fan, I can see how it might be a bit frustrating. It's definitely the least accessible of the live-action Star Wars shows. What I mean by that is, unlike the other live-action shows, you have to have done your homework beforehand, or you're going to be totally lost. Mandalorian, as long as you start with Season 1 and watch the other shows by their respective release dates, is pretty accessible, even if you have no prior knowledge of Star Wars. Andor is a prequel, so you need no prior knowledge of Rogue One to understand it. Everything you need to know to understand the Kenobi show is told you in the first episode. This show does not do that. It's basically Star Wars Rebels Season 5. I said in my trailer reaction I was worried that Ahsoka wouldn't feel like the main character, similar to how Boba Fett didn't feel like the main character in Book of Boba Fett, or how Din Djarin started to not feel like the main character in Mandalorian Season 3. And unfortunately, those worries were justified. I wouldn't be so frustrated with this if they had simply called the show Star Wars Rebels Season 5 or something similar, instead of simply Ahsoka, because Ezra feels more like the main character than she does. Ezra also feels like less of a character for the first half and more of a MacGuffin. They essentially redo with him what they did with Luke in The Force Awakens, where everyone is trying to find him. For how much they were advertising Thrawn as being the big bad guy of the show, he's not really given all that much to do. Again, the show focuses more on the Dathomir witches and Thrawn's other minions than it does him. Now, I know some people are going to be frustrated that even after all that, Thrawn still isn't defeated by the end of the show, but what they do with him is very similar to what they do with Darth Vader in New Hope. Yeah, he gets away, but anyone who saw New Hope for the first time, were they really that frustrated that Darth Vader gets away? I doubt it, because there's clearly more coming. Not necessarily in the form of Ahsoka Season 2, but I have a feeling with Dave having been given a Star Wars movie that he said is basically going to be his version of Avengers Endgame for all these shows, Thrawn might be the villain in that. That's just speculation. I did enjoy the little arc they gave Anakin and Ahsoka. It was very satisfying. But again, if you haven't watched Clone Wars, it's not going to mean much to you, but for me, it was very emotional. So if you're a diehard Star Wars fan, I'd probably love it, but for everyone else, it requires homework. Number 2, Bad Batch Season 2. This took everything great about Season 1 and did it better. It gave closure to hanging plot threads from Clone Wars like the Zillo Beast. It felt like it had influences from Avatar The Last Airbender with some of the plotlines of the show. The character growth and group dynamics felt heavier, and I'm very excited to see how Dave Filoni concludes the show with Season 3 later this year. And number 1 show of 2023 is Muppet Mayhem, a show that unfortunately got canceled. I was skeptical about a show focusing on the band from the Muppets. Their supporting characters, would they be able to carry their own show? Yes, they can, and it's hilarious. The celebrity cameos, callbacks to previous Muppets projects, and meta humor all feel very in line with what Muppets was like in its golden age. It's witty, self-aware, and fun. If you're a fan of classic rock or just music in general, there's a lot to appreciate. The show has everybody. Weird Al, Deadmau5, Ryan Seacrest, Kesha, the guy from Honest Trailers, many, many more stars, each of them giving hilarious performances even in their limited screen time. As great as the show is, though, I do have a couple of problems with it. For one, it focuses a bit too much on the human characters, at least for the first half. That wouldn't necessarily be a problem, except the main human characters aren't that interesting, and their performances are phoned in. Another issue is that it has a very similar plot to the Muppet 2011 movie, except instead of getting the Muppets together to save a theater, it's getting the Electric Mayhem together to make one last album. They've got their separate ways, they need to reunite, you've seen this before. There's also quite a few narrative cliches, such as Liar Revealed, or soap opera-style comic misunderstandings, and also, surprisingly, a few drug references. I know the Electric Mayhem are supposed to be hippies, but this is a Disney project, and the Muppets are generally a pretty family-friendly brand. They've had adult humor before, but it was more references to the celebrities or the self-aware humor that kids won't get, not drug references. The last couple episodes are trying a bit too hard to be modern, and they serve a lot of time spending on what's popular now, such as TikTok or Minecraft, and those bits feel more like commercials, which is not what Muppets should be. Muppets should feel timeless. There's a reason they've been popular for 50 years. Even in projects that actually were commercials, like the Haunted Mansion special, it still felt like its own thing. Because of that, the show is going to feel a bit more dated than some of the other projects. Ironically, the older Muppet projects feel less dated than these new ones. The Muppet Show and the older Muppet movies are still just as good now as they were 50 years ago. This show probably isn't going to be relevant in 5 years. Overall, though, this show had more or less what I was expecting Muppets to be. It had self-aware humor, sharp writing, and a lot of heart. This is the first Muppets project since Haunted Mansion, where by the end I thought, Jim Henson would be proud of this, not, oh my word, what have they done, what were they thinking, Jim is rolling in his grave. It's a bit of a rough road at the beginning, but by the end it led to a satisfying, heartwarming conclusion. Now just to give an idea of what to expect, this is an Electric Mayhem-focused show. None of the main characters like Kermit, Fozzie, Miss Pink, or Gonzo show up, not even as cameos, but the Electric Mayhem brings so much energy to the show you don't really notice their absence. This is certainly one of the better Muppets projects in a long time, even though, quite sadly, it got canceled, and it's no longer moving right along. So there you go, there's my ranking of the Disney Plus series. Let me know what shows you watched this year and how you would rank them, and I will see you next time.